is the Code Pink position on recent news in Ukraine? We support diplomacy, as do we in Gaza and Palestine. We're an anti-war organization, so all of our stances around every issue sort of are seated in our anti-war values. And our demands around Ukraine have always been, not just this week or last week, not since Donald Trump took office, but always has been against NATO and US warmongering, Russian troops out of Ukraine, diplomacy now, and end US weapons abroad. And that means everywhere, especially to Ukraine in this context, but we don't support any US weapon shipments anywhere. Um, and we know that really intense video came out of the White House last week. I'm sure a lot of you saw it between Zelenskyy, Trump, and JD Vance. A lot of people were focusing on the lack of decorum. I agree. Donald Trump's kind of a rude guy. I can't argue with you there. But we want to focus on the material realities facing Ukraine and Russia and what the war continuing would cost human life in both of those places and around the world. So a little more on that. The reality is the war risks triggering World War III. The United States has nukes, NATO countries have nukes, Russia has nukes. It's a very dangerous situation to be in. Too many people have already been killed, civilian and soldiers from both sides, and it's critical to find a solution as soon as possible to put an end to the killing. Without an end to US weapons to Ukraine, the war would continue to present an increased risk of a nuclear catastrophe. So that's the framework we're working from. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I could see you all. But we're going to go over some commonly asked questions of us. And hopefully Medea and Marcy can help me answer them for folks. Well, we can go over them sort of quickly. But hopefully we get them out of the way. We also sent around Medea's video from her book to help us understand and like come from the same framework. So I hope people were able to watch that. If not, we'll send it around after this. So first common question for Medea and Marcy, just chime in whenever. Isn't protecting Ukraine about fighting fascism and protecting democracy?
Medea, I'll defer to you first.
Oh, go first, Marcy.
Okay, well, I would just say that Ukraine, as we know it today, is not democratic. There are no elections. There's no free press. There's no freedom to assemble. Men are literally kidnapped off the street to fight Russia. So I have to dispel ourselves of this notion that it's an epic struggle to save democracy. It's an epic struggle to save the US proxy in that area. This is a proxy war from the beginning. In other words, using Ukraine, exploiting Ukraine to weaken Russia so the US can maintain global dominance. And I think that's the framework that we have to view everything through, you know, what the US's intentions were from, I don't know, 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union to today. The intention has been to maintain global dominance and hegemony, and to do that with Ukrainian lives. Medea.
Well, I think it's important to start out saying we condemn Russia's invasion. It's a violation of the UN Charter. And as an anti-war organization, we have to condemn countries that violate the UN Charter and go to war. But we also have to understand the context of this. And when we put it in that context, we see, as Marcy said, that there have been so many provocations and so many ways in which this was predicted. And because it was predicted, there were so many ways that could have stopped it. I mean, one easy way to stop it is just saying Ukraine is not going to be part of NATO, period. And there wouldn't have been an invasion. The other thing about are we defending democracy, it doesn't put into context the fact that there are areas of Ukraine, the Donbass and Crimea, that are primarily Russian, ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people, and that they, over time, in the case of Ukraine, going back to 1991, when after the breakup of the Soviet Union, said they didn't want to be part of Ukraine. So there are complicating factors in all of this that are important to understand. It's not simply the dictatorial Putin regime invading a country unprovoked.
Thank you. And just to speak a little bit on like my age cohort, I think there's just like a little bit of lack of historical information available. So when we think about like NATO, why should Ukraine not join NATO? Well, no one should be joining NATO is generally my thought. NATO was created after World War II to prevent Russia or the Soviet Union specifically from encroaching more into Europe. Just, the Red Scare tactics. So like I don't know if people recall, but the Soviet Union does not exist anymore. So why does NATO still exist is a good question to ask. That's why any country shouldn't be joining NATO at this point. You both sort of answered a little bit. Oh, I'll say it anyway. So this is a question a couple of you asked in some of our group chats. How is this invasion any different than Israel's attacks on Palestine? We covered the historical analysis a little bit there, but I'm wondering if you two want to add any thoughts.
Sure. I just want to first shout out to some of the people who are here who have been active in our Peace in Ukraine coalition. I see Laura, I see Cynthia, Melanie, a few others. And I know that we have varying levels of knowledge probably in this group. In terms of Israel-Palestine, I think I would think of it like this. Okay, Ukraine, if the US wants to maintain global dominance, which it does, Ukraine is the proxy. With Israel-Palestine, Israel is the proxy to maintain global dominance. People think of Ukraine as the David of the David and Goliath kind of relationship, but not when you factor in United States intervention, weapons, putting missiles that could be used for a nuclear attack in Romania, targeting Russia, European war games to practice annihilating Russia, and the fact that Russia has had a naval port on the Black Sea for many, many years and was very concerned about, with the expansion of NATO, having that displaced and in its place a US NATO military base. For geostrategic reasons, Russia was never going to accept that. And as Medea mentioned, a long succession of diplomats warned US presidents, Clinton, Bush, so forth, don't expand NATO to Ukraine, to Georgia. That will be an existential threat to Russia. So there were legitimate security concerns. And like Medea said, that doesn't excuse a violent Russian invasion, nor does it say that we support that. We don't support that. And we've been very clear about that all along. But by the same token, we don't pretend that the war and the violence started in 2022 when Russia invaded. The violence, I would say, started in 2014 with the US backing a coup, sinking $5 billion. Victoria Nuland, who was one of the highest officials in the State Department at the time, let us know about that as she was leaving not too long ago. So our support of this coup led to a central government cracking down on Russians in the East, and a lot of resentment. A separatist movement was created. I believe, Medea, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the referendum was held, and it's questionable whether or not the Russians, the ethnic Russians in the East even wanted to be part of Ukraine. Certainly ethnic Russians in Crimea associate themselves with Russia. So it's kind of complicated, but it doesn't mean that we support violence or we support invasion. Surely Russia could have gone to the United Nations and stated its case there, that it felt threatened, just as we would feel threatened if Canada or Mexico had a NATO or a Warsaw Pact, which doesn't exist anymore, military base on our border. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to compare atrocities because I think the people in Ukraine have suffered tremendously, as the people in Gaza did. But it is a comparison that's very far off. You'd have to think of Ukraine as a country that had been occupied by the Russians for decades, in which the entire population of Ukraine was brutally oppressed, where there was very limited self-rule, where the people of Ukraine could not even leave their country without the permission of the Russians, where Russia would have controlled all the imports and exports and the water and the electricity and everything going into Ukraine. I mean, that just wasn't the situation in Ukraine. It's also debatable what Russia was trying to do when it invaded Ukraine. I don't think Russia wanted to take over all of Ukraine and certainly didn't want to ethnically cleanse the Ukrainians as the people in Israel are doing to the Palestinians. I think Russia wanted to get back those areas that were predominantly Russian speaking, and I think they wanted to force Ukraine to be a neutral country, and that's very different from what Israel's intentions are.
Thank you both. And the final question I'll pose for this section, and we're getting it a lot, and a lot of people are talking about it online and in the news. Won't Putin keep invading Europe if we stop supporting Ukraine, and especially if they capitulate land in Ukraine?
I think we have to back up and say, is this just about Putin wanting to take over all of Europe, as Timothy Snyder or Tom Hartman would have us believe? Didn't Russia have some legitimate security concerns about having a NATO naval base on its border or in the Black Sea? Didn't it have some legitimate security concerns about ethnic Russians who were being shelled in the east, some of whom were burned alive by the Azov or the right sector, I'm not sure which, but those violent right-wing white supremacist militias in Ukraine? So as to whether or not Russia would want to take over all of Europe, I think they've lost about 500,000 soldiers. That's a heavy price to pay. I think the key here is that we don't want this to escalate any further than it already has. And Biden sending long-range missiles into Ukraine was really risking World War III. And as much as we may detest Trump and his administration, his cabinet, what he stands for domestically, I think we have to support a ceasefire and negotiations. Half of Ukraine in their latest Gallup poll said that's what they wanted. Quick negotiations to resolve this.
Yeah, they also said they were willing to cede territory if that's what it took. I said I didn't think Russia was even trying to take over all of Ukraine, but if they were, they certainly haven't been able to do that. They haven't been able to get more than 20% of the territory, and they already controlled most of that beforehand, with all of these weapons coming in from the United States and all over Europe. So even if that was their intention, they haven't been able to do that. And I don't think Russia would want to try to control a very hostile country like Ukraine. I don't think they would be able to do it with all of the not only fighting back that they would get, but all of the civil disobedience that they would get. They wouldn't be able to. So I think it's really fictitious to say that Russia is trying to take over all of Europe, or that this is a national security threat to us at home. What is a real security threat is the possibility of this expanding into World War III. And let's remember, World War I and World War II were both fought in Europe. And these are Russia is the country with the most nuclear weapons in the entire world. I mean, that is what is a real threat, is the expansion of this war. And that's why, as Marcy said, we support all efforts to find a negotiated solution. We were pushing Biden to talk to Putin for the entire time since the invasion. I have in my basement all kinds of banners that we put up saying, Biden, talk to Putin. This is something we had really been pushing for. So when Trump got on the phone and had a 90-minute conversation with Putin, we thought that was a very good start.
Yes, and I just want to add that there are people, they're all over my Facebook page saying Russia must leave immediately because if it doesn't, it's again another Palestine. This is a fight for democracy versus fascism, and this is the narrative that we are fed from corporate media. So I don't really blame people for believing this, because it's very hard to break through that. But we have to remember that, as Nikolai Petro says in his book, The Tragedy of Ukraine, Ukraine was not a united country before this. Again, as I said, it was at war from 2014 on. The western part of Ukraine fought with Hitler. The eastern part of Ukraine fought with Stalin during the World War. There is a statue to the fascist Stephen Bandera in Lviv in Western Ukraine. So while we must acknowledge that neo-Nazis are not in the parliament with any great representation, they are a very influential fighting force. And so when we're sending weapons, and now what is it, about 175 billion we poured into Ukraine, we have to ask, where are these weapons going to end up? They will end up in the hands of white supremacists.
Thank you,
I don't
Mark.
think people realize this.
Thank you both. So just to recenter us, Code Pink's stances are usually very focused on the belly of the beast. What is the US doing? Because those are like the levers. We're a US-based organization. And if the US's actions are prolonging war, whether it be through, deliberate negotiation sabotage, which the US has been a part of, they were very close to a peace deal in Ukraine after the invasion, and the US totally sabotaged that when Ukraine was in a pretty decent negotiating position. It is not in that position anymore because the US prolonged this war for so long. And it honestly, the video of Zelenskyy, from the White House, like all of you, like it broke my heart to see people get used by my country like that and just like thrown to the side. So our stance has always been consistent that we're against shipping US weapons because hundreds of thousands of people are dead, and the only people that benefited from it are weapons manufacturers in the US and in the West. So we're not on the side of Putin, like Medea emphasized, we were against the invasion. So I want to emphasize that to all of you. But you are being met with a media onslaught of coverage around Ukraine, especially in the last 2 weeks. So it's important when you're watching the news, especially like CNN and MSNBC, to ask yourself if when you're watching anything, really. We did a media literacy training a couple weeks ago. Whenever you're watching something, ask yourself what emotion are they trying to elicit from you and why. So I encourage people to think through that on this call. But before we move on to questions from you all, I want to pass it to Ryan to outline sort of the positions that exist on Ukraine, because I think that's important for moving forward on this. People have been confused, like, does Code Pink agree with Trump and the alt-right? Why is Bernie Sanders saying stuff that Code Pink doesn't agree with? It's all valid questions, so I'm hoping Ryan will cover some of that. Ryan, do you want me to share my screen?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Danica, Medea, and Marcy. We were talking earlier this week about this, and just think it's important to kind of break down the political spectrum here, because so often, when we discuss being pro-peace, in this situation, we're conflated with the alt-right, as Danica said. People try to make it, the mainstream media really frames it in this way, where Trump is this irrational actor, and then the Democratic establishment and anti-Trump Republicans are the sensible adults in the room, and they support prolonging this war. So I guess we can go from right to left here, and that is that we support the Trump administration's attempts to bring an end to this war, right? That is not a uncritical endorsement of all of Trump's policies. We know that there are different motives here, with the Trump administration, the far right in general. They've said that they believe that the US should take control of Ukraine's natural resources. Whereas we support countries' sovereignty, they don't believe, whereas we believe, that we should be spending money on life-affirming programs here. The Trump administration is not for universal health care. They're not for free college. They believe that we should be spending money on militarizing the border and potentially confronting China. And they want to withdraw from NATO because they are skeptical of, all these international organizations due to this America First position. So again, we're not just saying we support Trump uncritically here, but we do support a diplomatic solution to end the war. Then with the Democrats, we've, heard time and time again that anyone who supports peace is a Putin puppet or a Trump apologist. And the fact of the matter is, from the very beginning, since 2014, the Democratic establishment has really championed this war. Under Obama, the US backed the coup in Ukraine that really paved the way for the Russian invasion. And they support sending more weapons and money to Ukraine, no matter how much it costs the average American taxpayer. And really, they are, manipulating, as they do, the corporate media and the Democratic establishment are manipulating people into believing that they care about ordinary Ukrainians, right? But as Biden's Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin once said, the US wants to see Russia weakened. And that, of course, has come at the expense of Ukraine and all of its people. And yeah, it's just unfortunate that the Democratic establishment stands in the way of diplomacy and smears anyone who supports diplomacy as just a Putin apologist or whatever they want to call us. And then on the center left, unfortunately, politicians like Bernie Sanders and a number of prominent progressive media outlets have taken on a pro-war stance, which sucks. They don't typically acknowledge the events that led up to the invasion. And we know that context matters when talking about issues like this. And unfortunately, they do fall in line with the Democratic establishment in supporting sending more weapons and money to Ukraine to prolong the war. And yeah, their position has become virtually indistinguishable from the Democratic establishment position. And then that leads us to us, the anti-imperialists. We support a diplomatic solution. As I said, we're staunchly anti-war, and that means we are critical of Russia's invasion. But we understand that the war began in 2014 and not in 2022. We know that the US and NATO have stoked tensions with Russia for decades. There have been, decades of broken promises that have led us down this really catastrophic path and pushed us towards potential nuclear war, potential World War III. And yeah, we know that the US is using Ukraine as a proxy to weaken Russia and that ordinary Ukrainians are being used as pawns. We care about Ukrainian suffering, of course, and we know that prolonging the war will only prolong that suffering. And last but not least, we believe that US taxpayer money should be spent on healthcare, education, and housing instead of proxy wars.
Thank you, Ryan. That was great. I appreciate you.
Can I just add one thing to that? And I think that's great, Ryan. I would just say let's also recognize that on the right and the Republican right, there are still many who support the war in Ukraine. And so there are deep divisions within the Republican Party on this.